So, for example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act, is going to be, NAFTA is set into place, and as a trade agreement, it says that American capital is going to be exchanged for Mexican labor, right? And there's an infinity of trade agreements to talk about. That has regulations, right? That has rules. There's rules to this trade agreement. What's interesting, and I would argue what is contradictory, is that proponents of neoliberal economics want to remove the regulations in place so that the market will naturally race towards the bottom, meaning that I can outsource my labor, right? So you have a call center somewhere in, I don't know, Nashville. That call center employs 15,000 people. The rate at which those people are employed is much, much higher than employing English-speaking counterparts in a third world country, so the job is outsourced, right? The job is outsourced. Proponents of neoliberal economics want to deregulate that. They want to make sure that we can race close to the bottom as possible. In fairness to most neoliberal economists and supporters, they're not saying that they wanted to race to the absolute bottom, meaning free labor, but they definitely want to get pretty close to the absolute bottom, right? So let's remove all of those barriers that would otherwise obstruct the market from unraveling to its natural state. But, interestingly, during the trade agreements, they want regulation in the trade agreements, right? Because these people stand to make some money, and we can't have these people making money. Obviously, I'm being facetious. So here's an example. In this trade agreement, the first world invests capital, and that capital is used to purchase parts, right? It's used to purchase parts. So you can imagine, let's say I was, to go back to the example of shoes, let's say I was assembling shoes. It would be the rubber, it would be the yarn, the string, the glue, the dye for the colors, the different colors of the shoe. It would be everything that was needed to make a shoe. But this is, by its nature, parts are unassembled, right? Parts are unassembled. Well, these parts are then shipped to third world community, right? And what this trade agreement does is it makes sure that the tariffs and the taxes that would otherwise be paid in this exchange from here to here are foregone, right? So there are typically no taxes or decreased taxes. There are either no taxes or decreased taxes at this point, right? Why? Because to tax it is to tap into that profit, right? So I don't want it to be taxed when I'm sending stuff into your country. It's coming into your country, don't tax me. Well, if you don't tax me, well, what will I need to do? Well, when you return stuff to us, we won't tax you. So it's this agreement between nations. The first world says, listen, on us sending the parts into your country, don't tax us for the export of our product, and we won't tax you for the import of the return. So parts are sent, and these things are unassembled. Laborers receive the parts. These are laborers. Laborers receive the parts, and what they do is they assemble the parts, right? They assemble the parts to create what? Products. They create the phones and the shoes and the hats and the clothing. They create the desks and the furniture and the toys. They create everything, right? They assemble these things from their parts that were once initially parts, and they create products. So what's exported is parts. What's imported are products, right? So parts are exported to the third world, and then products are imported, and this too has no taxes or decreased taxes. Okay, so you can see now that there's an exchange for parts, for product, for capital, for labor, and this is sort of the relationship. And what's governing this relationship between the first and the third world are these trade agreements, right? And decreased taxes, no taxes. This is what allows it. This is the conduit with which this transaction between the first and the third world is facilitated. Without this, there would be a decrease in profit. Without this in place, there would be an inability to find sufficient labor to maximize my profits. Because if I tried to find labor here, the cost of that labor is a lot higher than trying to find labor here, because the cost of that labor is much lower here. Okay, so now we understand that the first concept is that the market should be deregulated. The argument for neoliberalism is that the market should be deregulated because it's good for the first world. And we can see why it's good for the first world, right? It's good for us in the first world because we have an increased profit margin, because our labor is so much cheaper. It's good for the first world because there are tariffs and taxes which are bypassed based on these trade agreements, which further maximize profit, which is good for the first world. And we hear so much about the benefit. Well, the question then is, what is it for the third world? Right? There's very, very few people that have really given time. Gitri Spivak, one of my favorite, I think she's a sociologist. She spent a lot of time discussing this, right? Edward Said, in his discussion on Orientalism, discusses this type of stuff, right? There are people who discuss it, but it hasn't been discussed to the extent at which the profit margin in the first world has been, right? Neoliberalism, of course, is great for the first world. Look what's in place to help the first world. Well, what happens with respect to the third world? Well, the first thing to recognize is that there will always be more capital. There will always be more capital in the first world than there are people that actually employ. All right? That sounds ridiculous, but it's true, right? If you're thinking about investing $100 million, which is a pretty meager sum for like an established corporation to invest in infrastructure and development. If you're talking about investing $100 million into an endeavor, and the labor costs in the third world are 25 cents an hour, right? So if my labor cost is 25 cents an hour, and it takes this laborer 8 hours to produce my product. So let's say it takes 8 hours. 8 hours at 25 cents an hour is $4, right? And that's a pretty decent sum in the third world. To be making $4 for the day, $4 US dollars, like the equivalent of $4 US dollars, in any third world, and any economist that you speak with who knows this stuff will know that that's a handsome feat, right? The number's unfortunately far, far less than that. But let's say you work 8 hours at 25 cents an hour. Okay? So then you think to yourself, and actually I take that back, it's $2. It's $2, sorry. So you work 8 hours and at 25 cents an hour, you make $2. You make $2 for your 8 hours. And in that 8 hours, you're able to produce the product, right? The product that you're producing is a shoe, right? And that shoe is retailed for $250. That shoe is retailed for $250. The question then, which you can obviously see, is that you're going to have to work a lot of time. You're going to have to work a lot of time as a laborer to be able to afford the very product that you create. I have the ability to create a shoe, right? And I recognize that I'm working 8 hours at 25 cents per hour. Let me get my calculator. If I'm working at 25 cents and the product costs $250, 250 divided by 25 cents an hour, I'd have to work 1,000 hours, right? I'd have to work 1,000 hours to be able to purchase the very product that I make.